The blood on the soil had not yet dried. Barely a year after the crushing fall of Longvek, the Khmer heart was still reeling from the shock. Entire noble families had been taken, cities emptied, and hope scattered like ash in the wind. But Ayutthaya was not yet satisfied. In 1595, under the command of King Naresuan, the Siamese war machine turned its eyes once more toward Cambodia, this time not to conquer its walls, but to own its soul. Cambodia, fragmented and leaderless, stood little chance, as shadows once again crept over the rice fields and riverbanks of the east. Another invasion was underway, not for territory alone, but to rewrite the identity of a people. This was not just war. It was subjugation disguised as diplomacy, and colonization cloaked in the robes of puppet kings. This is the forgotten story of how Siam returned, not with fire and swords alone, but with chains. Part 1. Shadows returned to Longvek. The sun had barely risen over the Mekong when fear began to spread through the fields of Cambodia. The air was thick, not only with mist and the scent of wet earth, but with Oni's haunting sense of unfinished trauma. It had been just a few years since the great city of Longvek fell under the weight of Siamese steel, its walls crumbling and its palaces burning as thousands of Khmer nobles were chained and marched away from their homeland. Cambodia bled then, and the wounds had not yet healed. But in 1595, the blood was about to spill again. For King Naresuan of Ayutthaya, the conquest of Longvek had not been enough. He had taken the city, humiliated the Khmer court, and plundered its treasures, but Cambodia's spirit had not yet been fully broken, and in his eyes, that was intolerable. To truly secure Siam's dominance over the region, he needed more than a sack of the capital. He needed to mold the kingdom itself, to remake Cambodia as a vassal under his grasp, a puppet led by rulers who would answer to Ayutthaya. It was not just about military victory, it was about erasing resistance, rewriting loyalty, and ensuring that the Khmer legacy of independence was drowned beneath the bootprints of Thai power. And so, as the dry season approached, King Naresuan summoned his generals once more. This would be the Second Cambodian Expedition. The memories of the previous war were still raw. After the fall of Longvek in 1594, tens of thousands of Khmer people, including aristocrats, artists, and monks, had been forced to march to Ayutthaya in chains. The elite class of Cambodia had been shattered, its royal court dismantled, its scholars silenced. The nation reeled under the loss, struggling to rebuild from the devastation. Yet within this struggle, there remained a flicker of resistance. Though Siam had claimed victory, they had failed to completely dominate the political structure of Cambodia. The throne remained contested. Puppet rulers emerged and fell, and the countryside boiled with unrest. This instability threatened Ayutthaya's strategic ambitions, and, for King Naresuan, it was the excuse he needed to strike again. The pretext was thin but effective. A supposed rebellion in Cambodia posed a threat to Siam's security. Khmer leaders loyal to Ayutthaya were under siege by rival factions. The kingdom was in chaos. If order wasn't imposed from the outside, chaos would surely spill over. And so, in 1595, Naresuan prepared a new invasion force. This time, the goal was not just to raid and retreat, it was to occupy, to install a loyal regime, and to hold it. The invasion was carefully orchestrated. Veteran commanders, many of whom had led the 1594 assault, were recalled into service. Troops were gathered from across Siam's territories, battle-hardened soldiers from the north, conscripts from the Central Plains, mercenaries with experience in jungle warfare. Elephants were fitted for war, supplies gathered, and banners blessed by Buddhist monks before being raised once more against the Khmer. The plan was swift and aggressive. Siamese forces would launch from Battambang and Surin, which had become staging grounds following the earlier war. From there, the armies would push east toward the heart of Cambodia, smashing through any opposition and making their way to the capital, which had only begun to recover from the previous siege. But what Siam met was not simply a broken people. Despite the devastation of the past, Cambodia had not surrendered. In the wake of Longvek's fall, scattered groups of resistance had formed. Local leaders rallied villagers to fight. Some sought revenge for family members taken in chains. Others fought for pride, for land, or for their gods. Guerrilla tactics had grown common. Fighters emerged from the forests, struck supply lines, and disappeared again into the green maze. Though the Khmer kingdom had lost its central government, it had not lost its will to resist. Still, Cambodia was fractured. Internal rivalries plagued the royal house. After Longvek fell, the question of who should rule became a festering wound. Siam installed pro-Thai figures on the throne, men who were seen by many Cambodians as traitors or weaklings. These puppet kings struggled to maintain order, and in some cases, their reigns collapsed entirely under the weight of popular fury. As such, when Naresuan prepared his second invasion, he claimed he was intervening to restore order and protect Cambodia from further descent into anarchy. In truth, it was a colonial narrative dressed in royal language. The Second Cambodian Expedition was about power pure and simple, and so, in late 1595, Siamese troops began their march. The terrain of Cambodia had always been both ally and enemy. The thick jungles, winding rivers, and treacherous marshlands slowed progress, but the Siamese were prepared. They brought engineers, scouts, and porters trained in jungle logistics. Fortress towns fell one by one. Some resisted fiercely, others surrendered without a fight, knowing the horrors that would follow if they refused. In every village taken, the story was the same. Rice granaries looted, temples defiled, children taken as servants, and nobles dragged in chains back toward Siamese camps. To the Khmer, it felt like history repeating. Only a year had passed since the last war, yet already their land was burning again. The horror of Longvek's fall had not been a chapter closed, but a prelude to greater suffering. One particularly brutal episode occurred outside the town of Beret. A group of Khmer fighters, mostly peasants, armed with spears and farm tools, attempted to ambush a Siamese supply convoy. At first, their surprise attack succeeded. Several carts were seized, and the invaders scattered. But reinforcements quickly arrived. The Khmer were surrounded. What followed was a massacre. Those captured were not simply executed, they were tortured. Limbs were broken, tongues cut out, and one man, identified as a former monk, was impaled and displayed as a warning. Villagers were forced to watch, and then the Siamese commanders set fire to the temple where the rebels had gathered. The smoke could be seen for miles. Elsewhere, the Siamese employed psychological warfare. Fake proclamations were distributed, promising peace to those who accepted Siamese-installed kings and destruction to those who resisted. Khmer messengers were intercepted and replaced. Rumors were spread that resistance leaders had betrayed their own people or fled the country. And in some areas, Khmer traitors, those who had sided with Siam, were made governors under Siamese protection. These figures were deeply hated, but with Siamese weapons behind them, they ruled with brutality. But Cambodia did not fall easily. The fragmented resistance was growing in unity. Though scattered, these groups began to coordinate. Secret networks linked villages and towns. Food and weapons were moved in hidden ways. Messages were passed through songs, carvings on temple walls, and even tattoos. One resistance leader, known only as the White Elephant's Curse, began to emerge as a symbol of Khmer defiance. His true name is lost, but tales of his raids against Siamese patrols became legend. He was said to have once been a servant in Longvek's palace, whose family had all been killed during the first invasion. He fought not for a throne, but for revenge. Part 2. Chains of Loyalty, Spears of Betrayal. The year was 1596, and the shadow of Ayutthaya's ambitions once again loomed over the suffering lands of Cambodia. After the humiliating loss of Longvek, just 2 years earlier, Cambodia's soul was broken, yet still breathing. The nobles deported, the capital destroyed, and the king taken as a vassal. But the peace was only an illusion. King Naresuan had not yet finished reshaping Cambodia into a puppet of Siam. His sword thirsted not only for submission, but for permanent influencer, Cambodia forever chained to Ayutthaya's will. This was not just conquest. This was re-engineering an entire kingdom. Following the fall of Longvek in 1594, the vacuum of power in Cambodia gave rise to internal chaos. King Chechetha and King Satha were either dead, exiled, or powerless. Siamese forces had kidnapped thousands of Khmer nobles, artisans, monks, and court elites and resettled them in Siam. The absence of leadership shattered the royal structure, and rival claimants and regional warlords fought over the carcass of a once glorious empire. Cambodia had no king, no capital, no unity. From the ashes, one man tried to resurrect Orderberam Richia, a relative of the royal family, who sought to re-establish the monarchy from Sri Sathor. But Ayutthaya would not allow such a thing without its approval. The notion of an independent Khmer king ruling from Cambodia, even in its weakened state, was unacceptable. King Naresuan prepared for another military campaign, not to conquer again, but to shape the political future of Cambodia itself. But the Khmer people were not blind to the reality around them. They saw their lands swarmed by foreign soldiers. They saw their temples desecrated, their young nobles missing, their daughters forced into slavery or concubinage, and their identity buried under the cultural weight of Siamese supremacy. What Ayutthaya called pacification, Cambodia knew as strangulation. In 1595, Naresuan dispatched envoys and military agents to gauge the situation and identify potential collaborators. Pro-Siamese Khmer elites, those who had either been spared or were returned in exchange for loyalty, were given incentives to align with Ayutthaya. Royal hostages held in Siam were promised elevation to puppet kingship if they agreed to serve Siam's interests. The message was clear: Cambodia's crown would be given, not inherited. Loyalty to Ayutthaya was now the only path to power. One such figure was Priya Ram, a Khmer noble who had previously served under King Satha. Naresuan positioned him as a potential ruler, weak enough to control, noble enough to be accepted. With Ayutthaya's support, Priya Ram was escorted back into Cambodia with Siamese troops as his backbone. He declared himself king and set up court at Longvek. Again, though the city remained in ruins, the real power, however, remained behind him: the generals of Ayutthaya and the watchful eyes of King Naresuan. The Siamese garrisons moved deeper into Cambodia, not just occupying cities but altering the structures of governance. Buddhist temples were rebranded, Khmer monks were replaced with Siamese clergy trained in Ayutthaya, and Khmer script in official documents was replaced with Ayutthayan styles. Cambodian identity was being scrubbed slowly, subtly but with precision. It wasn't enough for Cambodia to be defeated, it had to be transformed. Meanwhile, resistance brewed. Scattered remnants of the royal court, surviving warriors, and patriotic nobles refused to accept Priya Ram I's rule. They viewed him as a traitor, a puppet placed by the very invaders who had torn their nation apart. Guerrilla warfare intensified in the eastern provinces. Local commanders in Battambang and the Dangrek Mountains formed small militias to harass Siamese patrols and sabotage supply routes. They had little chance of victory, but their cause was survival, not conquest. One such resistance leader was General Kao, a Khmer commander who had once fought during the Longvek defense. Escaping the massacre, he rallied survivors and coordinated hit-and-run strikes against Siamese supply lines. His men refused to recognize Priya Ramai and instead pledged loyalty to a hidden royal heir rumored to be in exile in Laos. Kao's forces, though under-equipped, became symbols of defiance. The people revered them, even as entire villages were burned by Siamese retaliation. King Naresuan responded with brutal efficiency. Entire provinces were cleared. Villages suspected of sheltering rebels were torched. Their inhabitants marched in chains back to Ayutthaya or executed on the spot. Khmer records tell of women tied to poles, burned alive before their children. Temples that housed resistance meetings were demolished, and the monks accused of sedition were disrobed and killed. This was not war. This was extermination by slow administrative violence. In 1596, the Second Expedition entered its bloodiest phase. Naresuan personally led reinforcements to suppress the resistance and solidify Priya the First's rule. His army included not only battle-hardened Siamese veterans, but Khmer defectors, men who now raised arms against their own people in exchange for land or favor. These collaborators were used as translators, spies, and shock troops. To the Khmer resistance, this betrayal hurt more than any sword. At the same time, Khmer children were taken en masse. Some were forcibly converted to Siamese culture. Others were handed to Brahmin priests or placed in royal stables as servants, effectively erased from Khmer society. The long-term goal was clear: destroy the Khmer elite, dilute the population, and replace the leadership class with those loyal to Ayutthaya. But a kingdom doesn't die in silence. Amid the trauma, Khmer poets, monks, and chroniclers secretly documented the horrors. Fragments of palm leaf manuscripts from this era speak of rivers running red with the sorrow of our sons, of mothers burying infants in the woods to protect them from slavers. The trauma passed into myth, myth into memory, memory into identity. Cambodia was being beaten not only militarily, but spiritually. One monastery in Takeo smuggled refugees and wounded soldiers, shielding them with ancient rituals of protection. A monk named Vichia Tepi became a folk legend for refusing to bow before a Siamese general. When ordered to recite prayers for King Naresuan, he instead cursed him in Sanskrit, denouncing him as the breaker of Dharma. The monk was dismembered and thrown into a crocodile-infested moat. His name was whispered in rebellion for generations. By mid-1596, resistance collapsed in most regions. The Siamese burned what remained of royal infrastructure and enforced taxes through Khmer collaborators. Priya, now completely dependent on Ayutthaya, issued decrees that outlawed certain Khmer religious practices deemed disloyal to Siamese Buddhism. Traditional Khmer festivals were replaced by Ayutthayan holidays, and Khmer royal ceremonies were either cancelled or reinterpreted to mirror Siamese models. Cambodia was no longer just occupied, it was being rewritten, but Ayutthaya overplayed its hand. While short-term military control seemed complete, the psychological cost was incalculable. The Khmer people did not forget. Within a few years, Priya would be assassinated by his own guards, believed to be sympathetic to the fallen royal line. Though Siam would invade again in future decades, the hatred seeded during the 1595-96 expedition would echo for centuries. Every temple rebuilt, every monument restored, would carry the scars of this war. The Khmer soul had been wounded, but not extinguished, and thus ended the second expedition of King Naresuan, not with a glorious victory, but with a fragile silence held together by betrayal and blood. Now comes the final chapter: the long-term consequences, the human cost, and the buried truths. Stay with us for part 3. Part 3. The final blow in Cambodia's fall into puppethood, in the shadow of shattered temples and stolen sovereignty. The final act of Siam's second campaign into Cambodia unfolded not with a single climactic battle, but with a slow and excruciating unraveling of a civilization. By the year 1596, the once proud Khmer kingdom stood on its knees, not yet dead, but bleeding from 1,000 wounds inflicted by war, betrayal, and the cold machinery of Siamese expansion. At the start of this final phase, Ayutthaya's aim was no longer simply conquest, it was domination by manipulation. no longer content with ravaging the land or taking hostages. The Siamese court under King Naresuan sought to install a Khmer ruler who would govern not for the sake of Cambodia's people, but for the benefit of Siam. The chosen puppet was none other than Sriapa, the same prince who had once served Ayutthaya as a hostage and later became a willing collaborator in the previous invasion. In 1594, after the fall of Longvek, he had been taken to Ayutthaya and treated with honors. But those honors came at a cost: loyalty to Naresuan, not to Cambodia. Now, in 1595, with the former royal family fractured and the kingdom's institutions in ruins, Naresuan saw his moment to strike again, not with fire and steel, but with diplomacy backed by the threat of renewed bloodshed. Soriapa was crowned by Siamese decree. His installation marked not the rebirth of Cambodia, but the beginning of its submission. And yet, many Khmer nobles and provincial rulers refused to acknowledge him. These leaders, wounded but not broken, rallied behind surviving members of the old royal house and regional warlords, who had neither forgotten nor forgiven what Ayutthaya had done. Resistance simmered like glowing embers beneath the ashes of Longvek. In an effort to crush these embers before they became a firestorm, Siamese troops re-entered Cambodia in force during the dry season of 1595-96. The campaign was swift and calculated. Khmer resistance was scattered, poorly armed, and divided. The countryside burned once more, not because of siege or pitched battle, but through raids, massacres, and the destruction of food supplies meant to starve out opposition. Villages were conscripted, arrested, or disappeared. Fields were trampled under horses' hooves. Monks were defrocked, and temples desecrated under the suspicion that they harbored rebels. Even so, Cambodia did not submit easily. From the western provinces near Pasat to the eastern riverlands near Kompong, Cam, rebels fought back. Most were not professional soldiers, but farmers, monks, and disillusioned nobles who had lost everything. A few even targeted Soriapa's convoys and attempted to assassinate him, but King Naresuan's grip tightened. Ayutthaya poured in fresh supplies, weapons, and soldiers. Many of the rebels were betrayed from within or executed after capture. Siam's political warfare strategy paid off. Instead of uniting under a single banner, Cambodian resistance splintered each region, holding out for different pretenders, with no hope of cohesion. This fragmentation suited Naresuan's aims perfectly. Under the surface, another form of war was waged: cultural colonization. The Cambodian royal court, now in exile and scattered, saw its customs eroded by Siamese influence. Proclamations were issued in both Khmer and Siamese. Tax systems were restructured to mirror Ayutthaya's bureaucracy. Buddhist relics were removed and sent to Siamese temples. Khmer children, taken during earlier campaigns, were raised in Ayutthaya as servants and conscripts, brainwashed into obedience to a foreign crown. By 1596, the last major resistance had been stamped out. Soriapa reigned, but his court was hollow. Real power belonged to Siamese generals and advisors stationed across Cambodia. Puppet officials replaced traditional local governors. Cambodian sovereignty was now a shell, an illusion barely sustained by titles and pageantry. It is in this period that one begins to understand the full devastation wrought not only upon Cambodia's infrastructure and leadership, but on its very identity. The greatest tragedy of the Second Cambodian Expedition was not the military defeat, it was the severing of continuity. The Khmer Empire, once builders of Angkor and masters of irrigation and temple architecture, had now lost not just cities but cohesion. The scholars who had kept traditions alive were dead or displaced. Royal libraries had been burned or plundered. Language, ceremony, and memory, all the lifeblood of a civilization, were under siege. And yet, even as the noose tightened, there remained flickers of defiance. Some Khmer warlords fled deep into the forests, refusing to bow to the Siamese-backed regime. In isolated villages, oral histories preserved what the burning of scrolls could not. Children were taught not to forget. They memorized the names of stolen kings, massacred monks, and the cities razed by foreign hands. But memories alone were no shield against the rising tide. In the decades that followed, Soryapa's descendants ruled under Siam's shadow. The nobility was purged, reshaped, or assimilated. Cambodia's role in the regional order had been violently inverted from an imperial peer of Ayutthaya to a vassal, a supplier of tribute, and a pawn in Thailand's expanding geopolitical chessboard. Even trade was reoriented to benefit Siam. Precious woods, elephants, and labor flowed from Cambodia to Ayutthaya. In return, the Khmer received trinkets, promises, and humiliation. Behind closed doors, some Siamese nobles even debated whether the entire territory should be annexed outright. But Naresuan understood that maintaining a facade of Cambodian independence would serve his ambitions better. A puppet state could absorb local backlash, sparing Siam the costs of direct occupation while still enjoying every benefit of control. The psychological scars of this strategy are evident in Cambodia's later history. The seeds of division planted during this time between Khmer, who collaborated, and those who resisted would sprout in future civil wars and internal purges. Trust in the monarchy was eroded. Faith in independence became tempered by cynicism. There is something particularly cruel in the way Cambodia was made to bleed, not just from the sword but from betrayal. By elevating Soryapa, Siam had turned a son of Cambodia into an agent of her subjugation. And so we return to the question, was this a war between kings or a war upon a people? The answer, tragically, is both. By 1597, the war was over, but Cambodia was no longer the same. Her capital cities had fallen, her royal lines had splintered, her children had been taken, and her sovereignty had become little more than a performance staged for the benefit of foreign rulers. This is the bitter legacy of the Second Cambodian Expedition under Naresuan, a campaign that did not just conquer land, but extinguished hope, rewrote memory, and redrew the map of Southeast Asia through pain. And yet, the Cambodian spirit endured. In the villages where children whispered forbidden names, in the mountains where monks buried sacred texts, in the minds of survivors who would rather die than kneel there, lived a stubborn, desperate flicker of freedom. It is from these ashes that the next chapters of Cambodian resistance would one day emerge, but those would come later. For now, the curtain falls on a kingdom reduced to shadow and echo. This was not simply a campaign. This was not merely a victory. This was erasure. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.